Hello, for this quick lesson we're going to learn multiplying with variables. Just a quick definition, we will be working with things called terms. Terms are groupings of multiplication and division, and so in an equation you might have multiple terms connected by addition signs or subtraction signs, but within these terms that I'm bracketing off, you will have numbers and variables being multiplied. And so here's an example of a mathematical statement with three terms: 2x, 4xy, and 5y. These are all examples of mathematical terms: 2x, 4xy, 5y, and so this is to help you differentiate between what I'm going to be using how I'm going to be using the word term and how I'll be using the word mathematical sentence. So these are terms, this is the sentence. Alright, so now that I've defined what a term is, we can get into what happens when you multiply variables and numbers together to create a simplified term. So if you have multiple things being multiplied together or divided, any rules that we talk about with multiplication also apply to division. So 3 times 2 times x times x times y. What happens? How do we simplify this term? Here's how. When you multiply, you start to combine things. And what I mean by combine is, if they're numbers, you multiply those numbers. If they're variables, you multiply those variables. However, you can only combine by multiplying similar items or similar things. So multiplying numbers. You may multiply numbers. You may multiply similar variables, but you cannot multiply different variables. So to simplify this term, we can multiply 3 times 2, which is 6. We can multiply x times x, which is x squared. And then we have a y. The y can't multiply with anything because it's different than the numbers and the x variables. So the most simplified version of this term is 6x squared y. Now, suppose that you have a term that's sort of out of order. All right. So suppose you have a term that's 6 times x times 2 times negative y times y. Here's the order that you want to put it in. First, you want to do the negative or positive signs. And so, like the last lesson, you want to look for negatives throughout this equation and say, what is the answer going to be? What is the whole term going to be? There's one negative, so the whole term is going to be negative. That's because it's an odd number of negatives. Then you want to look for numbers. 6 times 2 is going to be 12. Then you start to go in alphabetical order with the variables. You have an x here. There's no other x's, so just the x. And then you want to look for the next order of the variable, and you have 2 y's. Now, I've already dealt with the negative. The negative went to the front of my equation. And so we can ignore the negative and just say we have a y and we have a y. And those 2 y's are going to multiply together to equal y squared. So the simplified version of this term is 12xy squared. And when you simplify terms and you have multiplication in them, you actually don't have to write dots. You can just write the sign, the number, variable, variable. And if they're all right next to each other, you don't have to write dots. You only have to write dots when you have two things of the same type. So if you had two y's, you'd have to write a dot between them. If you had two numbers, you'd have to write a dot between them. But when you've simplified it and you only have one thing of each type, you don't have to write a dot. All right, and now let's try something with division. So suppose you have an equation x times y divided by 3 times x. Don't forget that when you have a large dividing by symbol, the top and the bottom are grouped. And so you can't do x divided by 3 times y divided by x. You first have to do the top, then you have to do the bottom. And so you got to look at the top and say, does this simplify at all? Y, x and y, can they combine? They can't. The bottom, does 3 and x combine? They can't. A number and a variable is a no-no. So now we look up and down and we say, let's first find the numbers. There's not a number on top, there's a number on bottom. And you don't have to simplify the numbers further, but you could. You could note that a 3 on the bottom is actually the same thing as having like a 1/3. In front of any multiplication string, you can always have multiplying by 1. You can add that on because multiplying by 1 doesn't change anything. So if you have this multiplying by 1 in front of there, and you can see there is a 1/3. And so we have our number is 1/3. And now we're looking for our variables. We have an x on top and an x on bottom. If we have x divided by x, that means a number divided by itself. And when you divide a number by itself, say we did 5 divided by 5, that answer would always equal 1. So the x divided by the x is just 1. And now we have a y over here. The y is on top. And so you may wonder how to simplify this y, how to get rid of this fraction symbol around it. The y, like I said earlier, you can always multiply stuff by 1. And so suppose we add a 1 to the bottom. And so we have y divided by 1. Now, the reason why I'm showing you this isn't because I want to contradict my previous statement of saying you can't combine numbers and letters. What this is showing you is that y on the top of a fraction is the same thing as y over 1. And any number divided by 1 is just that number. Because the dividing by 1 doesn't do anything. So that is just a y. So then you have times y at the end of this. Now we can simplify this one further. We can simplify it by, we have the two numbers here, 1/3 and 1. This one doesn't do anything. Multiplying something by 1 doesn't change the equation. So we have 1/3 times y, or 1/3